all for having me here today. It's such a beautiful place, the Valley. It's such an optimistic place, bright people, a lot of energy, and the campus has changed incredibly since the time I was here. I love the concept of this fusion between architecture and landscape and planning. That's how the world works, right? We're not in these silos. When I was a student here, I took building technology courses, I took architecture courses, I was a landscape architect, but it was really the kind of nexus of all those things that was so bright, and that was where the future was at. I married a planner from MIT, and so I have those sensibilities as well. Today I'm going to introduce you to my work. My work really happened in 3 segments of my career. The first segment being kind of private fee-for-service design practice, really working on some incredible projects that are not necessarily your everyday projects. They're not replicable. They're the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or 7 World Trade Center, or the Elevated Acre. Things that are unique and not necessarily scalable to everyday people, everyday places. So when I had the opportunity to move over to the GSA as the National Design Director, it really allowed me to think more critically with how do we magnify the work we're doing, how do we broaden its impact, how do we really leverage the desire that government has, but there's very few people to actualize the impacts. And so I like to say for the last 10 years, and probably longer than that, we've been in kind of a state of experimental governance, where there is a huge opportunity for creative thinkers to bring really unique ideas to government, and we should think about how we're going to bring those opportunities forward. A common thread in my work, both as designer and as client, has been connection between site and architecture, between people and place, between culture and vision. And here today, I'm going to lay 3 projects before you, 1 that I designed, and then 2 that I incubated as a major client, to really set the arc for a framework for landscape commissioning at a national scale. But before I do that, by a show of hands, can I see how many landscape architects are here today? Architects? Planners? Got it. Okay, so it's there's a good mix of folks in the room. It's 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. How many people want to see just pretty pictures? My hands are up. No? A few? I get it. I was here once. I mean, sometimes I would walk in here, a much less beautiful room, but I would walk in and just want to see some pretty pictures. And sometimes I'd want to hear really provocative ideas. And quite honestly, I'm going to give you a little bit of both today. Evolutionary infrastructure. Blue-green infrastructure has been the rage for decades. Jack touched on it. Everyone has been about essentially how do you take all this effort, all this energy around infrastructure and achieve more, achieve cross benefits by utilizing nature-based systems, right? That's the new terminology du jour. Evolutionary infrastructure is just, it sounds complex, but it's as basic as something that's representing the dynamism of which is a landscape. You know, all landscapes are born. Some of them suffer mightily. Others live a really long and healthy and happy life. But they all are born, they all take care, and they all take reinvestment. And so today's discussion is really going to be about something that I encountered, a real gap that I encountered as a design practitioner, and that's kind of stuck in my craw, as they say. And then when I became a client, I said, you know, I'm going to leverage this position to change this, to begin to change the paradigm around this issue. So what Jack touched on is exactly that. There's been a lot of work over the last few decades about what I would term site analytics, landscape analytics, looking at how projects perform. They're usually divorced from the actual projects. There's third parties who come in, like the Landscape Architecture Foundation. They look at some of the basics, whether that adaptive feedback loop that Jack Ahern used to always mention in his lesson actually happens, and this knowledge comes to impact the pre-planning phases and the program of requirements and these things that form projects in the upstream before a designer ever touches them. Not so sure, right? So it's really about how do we move from predictive to actual performance. And by that I mean taking lead and sites and even regulatory policy that's really all about what is your design intending to do on a piece of paper when you submit it for a building permit. Great, you can get the permit, you know you're going to achieve the second, the 100th percentile storm, whatever it might be, but then you go out into the field and that project might not be performing as intended. There's a whole lot of variables that happen between permit and construction that really impact the ability for a project to perform. So it starts with analysis, moved over to landscape commissioning as a concept, and then we have a framework that we can scaffold new projects in. The first project I wanted to touch on really quickly today was a joint venture that I was the design lead on between Tom Balsley's office, architectural group called Weissman & Freddy, and Ara as the infrastructure designer. So waterfront site, reworked urban fabric in New York City directly across from the United Nations building on the East River, tidal strait. Former tidal wetland site, took on an industrial use for many years, break bulk shipping primarily. Obviously we know what happened to break bulk shipping, that's not a thing today with containerization. A lot of things happening, and by the way, as an aside, when we developed this project, we actually worked with a studio at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm on the design school board at the University of Pennsylvania, to work with a studio there to actually work with us on our analysis of this site, which was incredibly enriching to the entire process. The moving to the kind of design concept of this site, it's a site that's been published 20 times over. It's received 50 international awards. The project is all about connection. As I mentioned, my work, the work on the teams I've been involved with, has all been about connection. Certain connection between landscape and the river in this case, and the communities and the park, but also about how to provide active and passive recreation, how to connect hydrological systems with building systems, site hydrological systems with building systems, that sort of thing. These diagrams kind of describe that a little bit, those kind of connections. Many sites accrue different levels of complexity. This project is probably one of the more complex I've ever worked on. This diagram in front of you basically explains on the northern end of the site, this project that we were building on top of the Queens Midtown Tunnel and the most major electric transmission line that basically powers all of East Midtown Manhattan, and the seven train tunnels and the Long Island Railroad tunnels, incredibly complex infrastructure. But it was also a site prone to flooding. So we were also layering infrastructure on top of this. The southern end of the site, we were creating tidal wetlands, reworked fabric in this area. And there was responsiveness to how we wanted to engage the site and the dynamic nature of the tidal strait itself in terms of its flooding. East River has a tidal prism between high and low tide. It's about 4.5, 5 feet every day. And so, and then with Superstorm Sandy and events like that, many of the parks washed out and are prone to that sort of aggressive episodic flooding. We designed this site with all of those things in mind, and it's actually one of the few sites that survived Superstorm Sandy and the city with very little damage, and the city used it as their kind of emblem for what it is they were trying to achieve in their new waterfront edge design guideline program. But again, about connections. Here's a pavilion where we caught stormwater, pushed it into biofiltration swales, produced enough power through photovoltaics to power the entire park. And then creating, not flattening the site, but leveraging its topographic kind of nature. As you can see on the lower right, it's a fill site to basically create these promontories and these kind of eco-exploratory kind of natures, public natures, if you will. Here's the final concept vision, and here's the constructed site. And I'm sure you guys have seen this in publications. Here's a rail garden I designed and reinterpreted. Here's the wetlands. That little walkway on the edge is a breakwater to keep a lot of the fetch. The East River's fast moving, and the fetch of the wind-driven waves would just scour out a wetland. So we had to create a pervious breakwater, a promontory so that you could take in the multiple boroughs. You know, it's right at the nexus of Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. An island that emerges twice a day when the wetland between the island and the upland floods. Urban beach, and then these kind of aggregate social spaces along this pervious breakwater. The reason I'm showing you this project, though, isn't about really the pretty pictures. I'm just kind of trying to give you a concept of kind of what's happening here. What really drove me insane about this was that the regulatory policy framework in which we were working in required us to meet certain obligations in terms of stormwater management, in terms of energy, et cetera. But it assumed that all of those standards would need to be met on day one. So if you were designing a 2-inch storm system, on day one it needed to be meeting those obligations. So basically all of this nature-based infrastructure in the current United States has to be over-designed. So basically by year 3, by year 5, these projects are doing 3 times, 5 times, sometimes 10 times more delivering 10 times more environmental benefits than what would be required under a regulatory framework. So why is that a problem? It's not a problem in terms of, hey, more nature, that's great, better, but it's a problem if we're trying to basically move blue-green infrastructure out nationwide and trying to engage the private sector in not overbuilding. It's also a problem if we're trying to take construction dollars and treat, say, the first 3 years after landscape construction as maybe the last landscape establishment as the last phase of landscape construction. Maybe a more intensive period of establishing the landscape, right? So that it's producing higher degrees of performance. So this is kind of, I could show you a lot of projects, but this is kind of what moves me from designer to design client. And I was kind of operating in kind of those 2 realms that Jack mentioned. Capital program, about 80 major capital projects at a time. Major capital project for the GSA is about $50 million to about $1.5 billion for a single project. And so how do we define our goals? How do we amplify the achievements? GSA, just to give you a sense, I'll run through about 10 slides really quickly to give you a sense of the types of things that they do. Here's a land port of entry on the northern border. It's a timber port moving timber from Canada to the United States and cattle from the United States to Canada. One of our UMass distinguished alum, another fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and a friend of mine, he was the site designer on this, Shane Cohen, wonderful guy. So here's a northern land port of entry. Here's a federal courthouse in Albuquerque, New Mexico, first LEED sites, dual certified courthouse in the United States. All about basically repurposing. This is a center city site, all about capturing water, repurposing. We took this old site that was just mineral surface as far as the eyes can see, all paved, and we used it as a selective quarry, quarried all the stone out of the site itself, basically stacked it up, and then used it to redirect and move water around the site. Material science and satellite office in Suitland, Maryland. This is another kind of project typology GSA works in. Land port of entry on the southern border, Columbus Land Port of Entry. This is at the nexus, at the base, of a 100 square mile drainage area. First site's LEED certified project, Land Port of Entry project ever. And you can see that these projects kind of have a playful quality, as serious as they are. And this is, let's face it, our client on this is USDA and Customs and Border Protection. These aren't always, you know, it was easier when I was doing the projects in New York, and it was like the Parks Department and the Economic Development Corporation. They're a much more joyful. Here's a project, 1,500 acres in Blackstone, Virginia, for the Department of State. This is a diplomatic security training complex. This is like where you would pull up in the middle of a forest, a national forest, and get to a gate, and you would think you would see Tom Cruise and with a retinal scan. It's a very intense project. 1,500 acres, drive tracks, smoke houses, rappel towers. Here's a Class A office building. The United States trains other diplomatic security organizations from our allies from around the world. So if you're in England and you're the equivalent of diplomatic security, or Germany or France or Spain or Italy, you come here and you do your training here because the Americans build the craziest stuff out there. So this here is an academic building. Here's a firing range. Going to Lower Manhattan, here's the redevelopment of 26 Federal Plaza landscape. This is on a federal building in Lower Manhattan. When this project was originally envisioned, and Richard Serra did the tilted arc across the project site maybe now 40 years ago, it was kind of unloved and kind of widely despised by people in the building and in Lower Manhattan. Well, Lower Manhattan has changed a lot. You know, now it's got 3 times the volume of families and kids that it did even 10, 15 years ago. So re-envisioning this project required also thinking a little bit differently about what a federal site in a really tight urban area would be. This is a quick, interesting project. All of these projects, by the way, are LEED certified, site certified, all of that litany of stuff. But still, I'm going to speak to where it's falling short and where the field is falling short in a minute. This is 50 UMP, 50 United Nations Plaza in San Francisco, 1930 Beaux-Arts building, redeveloped it. It's right on San Francisco City Hall Plaza. Did a parterre garden, and this is directly after it was planted, so it looks a little like a plucked chicken, but I promise it's different now. But what's really interesting is very formal in its plan view, but you get down on the ground plane and it's very dynamic in terms of kind of its visual and textural quality. So this brings us, that just gives you a quick overview of some of the projects that kind of GSA is kind of moving and operating. But this brings me to a project I want to focus on for a second, which is the United States Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. I think Chris Ellis maybe spoke here a year or two ago from the University of Maryland. I contracted the Landscape Architecture Foundation at the University of Maryland to basically do a deep dive on this project. And it's like part of their case study investigation, but imagine that times 10, much bigger set of documents, much deeper dive. This is Washington, D.C., for those of you who don't know, is sitting basically at the bottom of about 120, 130-foot vertical bowl. And so all of the capital planning commissions around D.C. are very concerned about the visual impacts from any projects in Washington, D.C. U.S. Coast Guard headquarters, it's a 1.15 million square foot building, office building over 11 stories that basically descends down that topographic bowl hillside. 3rd largest green roof in the world still today, about 12 or 13 acres of green roof, both intensive and extensive. All of these achievements go on and on. On Plan North is basically the top of the slope. On Plan South is this huge retention basin. The federal government basically has to meet the highest stormwater management requirements of any jurisdiction I've ever worked around. So, Washington, D.C. is no different. When we got there, the locals, wherever we get, are always, very prideful in LA, wherever it might be, prideful about how stringent their codes are. And we're like, listen, our codes are going to be more stringent. Well, this project is always all about the hydrology. We would always say the wetter, the better, right? One side note here is Washington, D.C. has something really interesting. They have a stormwater retention credit trading program where you can capture and manage stormwater, like what we see outside around the perimeter of this building, and you could do even more of it on your site, and we're seeing this in churches, community organizations, etc. and then you could literally sell your credits to other developers who are space confined or who cannot meet those requirements. So there's a little kind of burgeoning market in that space. But again, this project was all about hydrology, and our concerns were about dewatering this plateau at the top, moving water through this site, basically cleaning it at the bottom. And our requirement was to basically treat a 1.7-inch storm, which on this particular site was somewhere in the realm of 250,000 gallons of water. So here we had to do that on day one, despite us doing this Herculean piece of green infrastructure. When we actually went back and looked at this project and started discussing kind of where it had arrived by year 3 and year 5, not only in stormwater were we processing almost 800, 900,000 gallons by year 3, but we were, to speak to Jack's point, we were retaining all these other co-benefits. We were sequestering almost a million pounds of carbon per year, and comparatively to a speculative office space would be only about a tenth of that, about 100,000 pounds of carbon per year. We're also seeing incredible returns on lower employee absenteeism. We were seeing higher, this is Coast Guard itself reporting this, higher worker productivity, greater pride, like federal agencies do these employee viewpoint surveys where they basically try to tap into the morale of their staff. When they had co-located in the space, their morale went up like 25 points. So I could go on about just the environmental accomplishments with this project, but again, it was emblematic of the policy goals that we're trying to hit on year 1. We don't have a mechanism for really capturing how nature is kind of growing in and yielding higher performance standards and benefits. Sorry, here's some, this is a pretty picture. So this is captured stormwater. There's very mannered stormwater details like this here, which there's skin fountains and the like. Here's some descending courtyards with water features, all recirculated water. Major green roof areas, huge stormwater catchment areas with weirs and the like, check dams. Areas that are just massive, where there's just areas allowed to just be vernal pools. And they are. When you go there, I've been on this project where there are bald eagles just sitting in trees. There are deer will walk right onto the roofs and not have any sense that they're standing on a piece of architecture. There is a complete threshing of landscape and architecture on this site. And then this is the catchment, the metaphorical Chesapeake Bay. At the top, the landscape system is designed to be more of like a montane, West Virginian, and recharges the site. The next project, and this is the project that probably lit my hair on fire the most in terms of saying we have to do something about this. Here's a land port of entry in Arizona, Nogales land port of entry. It's the 4th busiest land port of entry in the United States on the southern border. It's fruit and vegetable land port. Probably many of the fruits and vegetables you guys have eaten in the last few months have come from this port. It was a dusty, dry, arid, hostile port, and you can see it in this aerial. And this isn't just goods, this is people, human beings kind of moving back and forth across the border, right? As part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we developed this port, and every project, and I think Joe Volpe used to say this, or maybe it was Ken Smith, one of the two of them used to say this: we need to have a good concept here, otherwise this thing's going to turn to dog meat by the end of the process, right? So every project, you have to have a good concept, otherwise you won't have a North Star for where it's going. And the concept here was all about water. It was about how do we change the thermal comfort in this area? How do we do that responsibly? How do we create new textures and new environments to make this a different type of place? This project, I'm going to show you a little quick video, a 5-minute video to break up my talking, but the project is all about water, as you can imagine. And the result is a much different design expression, both environmentally and visually, texturally. You could see how lush this pedestrian area is versus what I'm about to show you in the video.
An oasis conjures many romantic thoughts. Bedouins lounging by a life-giving pool of water in the middle of the Sahara. Native Americans locating sources of water to irrigate crops newly sown in the Sonoran Desert. An oasis provides a respite from the environment, a dignified and comfortable place for the trade of goods and stories. The new Mariposa Land Port of Entry is this respite. It is also a complex lightning rod of a project, sitting on one of the most contentious borders in the Americas, at the eye of a whirlwind of debate over liberty, migration, and trade. Located just west of Nogales in southern Arizona, this 55-acre, 270,000 square foot project strikes an impressive balance between security and a dignified welcome, between efficient operations and a comfortable environment for staff, and achieves sustainability within a harsh and unforgiving desert climate. At a basic level, this region is defined by a geopolitical line on the earth that divides the American dream from human beings in need. Many, in attempts to navigate this line, risk their lives. In his poem, Borderlines, Arizona's 2014 Poet Laureate Alberto Rios clearly sees the border is what joins us, not what separates. Inspired by this clarity of thought, the design of this port of entry aspires to reach out with grace and authenticity to our southern neighbors and say welcome. Inextricably a product of both the General Services Administration's Design Excellence Program and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, this new port of entry demonstrates responsiveness to local traditions and expression of culture, placing great value on a sense of dignity, elegance, and strength. Designed as a cultural connection rather than a division, the threshold of the new port is an entry pavilion inspired by the waving red, white, and blue flag. Additionally, this major reinvention of the fourth busiest port in the U.S. and Arizona's largest commercial port is on track for LEED Gold. Traffic flows and internal circulation is a key element to the success of a port. Diagramming the existing operations exposed extreme deficiencies and emphasized that a clear and efficient pattern of movement was critical. The solution to the chaos was found in the clarity of a railroad yard design, smooth, continuous paths, optimized movement. To complement this planning strategy, the idea of a desert oasis, a life-giving source of water in the middle of a harsh climate, was implemented. Mariposa is designed around the concept of creating an oasis within a bustling vehicle and pedestrian processing station. The intent of this idea is to infuse the human experience, both for visitors and staff, with a connection to nature, and thus some dignity and relief from daily stress. The clear zoning of the site emphasizes smooth traffic movement around the centrally located oasis. The vitality of the port comes from its handling of water, a critical element in the desert. Nogales is characterized by massive rainfalls during the monsoon season, paired against many months devoid of precipitation. The pavement and grooves throughout the port's campus are carefully designed to harvest this rainwater. In a typical year, the project will be net zero water for irrigation. From April through June, there is a calculated shortage of 746,000 gallons. To accommodate this shortage, a rainwater harvesting storage system of 1 million gallons was designed to allow for prolonged periods of drought. In August of 2013, monsoon rains maximized the storage capacity in only 2 weeks. The oasis respite and the celebration of rainfall in the desert work in tandem with a clear and secure planning diagram to create a more humane experience. The buildings and exterior spaces are designed to enhance the staff's and users' operations through program, flow, natural daylighting, views of nature, thermal comfort, safety, color, and water harvesting. Pervious paving, sunken gardens, and sculptural scuppers are integrally designed throughout the site and buildings. Shade trellises and vegetation work together in the oasis to provide a comfortable, safe zone for officers and staff. Many design iterations of scuppers and catchment devices were studied. Because water is precious in the desert, the scupper and downspout system is an opportunity to celebrate a rain event. Roof water is focused through steel pipe splash guards and into a sunken garden below. When a rain event results in more than 2 inches of water in the garden, it overflows into an underground drainage system, which is connected to the water harvesting storage tanks. The focal point of the oasis is the pedestrian plaza. At the center of the plaza is a dramatic scupper and catchment basin. The crash plate of the scupper focuses all water from the 26,000 square foot canopy roof into the collection basin. This basin connects directly to the underground drainage system and water harvesting storage tanks. At the Oasis Plaza, a bioremediation fountain helps filter harvested water, while providing an intimate space for private reflection filled with the calm and soothing sounds of water. The Mariposa Land Port of Entry is a study in transformation. Before there was a dangerous mix of vehicular and pedestrian traffic arriving in the United States via what is essentially a parking lot. The new arrival experience demonstrates how through careful planning and thoughtful water harvesting design, a beautiful and vital landscape can be sustained, one that embodies the best aspirations of the United States.
Okay, so we did a deep dive on this project as well, post-construction, and everything you saw in there is largely accurate, except it was constructed with major errors. There was errors with controllers, hydrological controllers bringing chiller water to the site water into the chillers. There was problems with how this 1 million gallon cistern was constructed. And these are the things that clients don't want to put out there and celebrate, but they're the reality, the gap between prescriptive performance and what is actually happening in the field, right? So in order to kind of change that paradigm, you have to be honest about the state of the field, the state of the art. And if you want to move to measuring and verifying performance, I wanted to borrow a concept known as commissioning. Commissioning is an old military concept where military tools, particularly ships, would be commissioned. They would be built, all the systems would be tested, they would be put on the water, the crews would learn how to operate those systems, they would know how to repair those systems on the fly so that they could ensure that these projects were functioning as intended. Public Utility Canada took this kind of idea that was, started in the Navy maybe 100 years ago, and I'm sure there's quite a few versions before that, and they started applying it to dynamic architectural systems, maybe 40 or 45 years ago. Then it took off in the United States, and we started utilizing it in dynamic building systems, HVAC systems, plumbing systems, etc. And I said, well, why don't we apply that to blue-green infrastructural systems? Why don't we think about that as a process and a framework for kind of elevating what it is we're doing and kind of scaling it up? So I commissioned a study born out of necessity, which was essentially called a white paper, a position paper. If you want to influence policy at the federal level, part of it is obviously studying your own work and creating a real database of what you're doing, and then creating a position paper so that you can bludgeon policymakers with this new knowledge. So it was all about verifying performance. It was all about really utilizing the scale of the GSA, the federal government, to transform the market. It's a commissioning study that has quite a lot of different elements, from a literature review and case studies and industry analysis that crosswalks all of the facility standards and US Green Building Policy standards. And it's also about people. We gathered about 90 experts together in 7 working groups, from soils and water and material and climate and human health and well-being, to really start thinking about how we would take measurement and verification and training to that next level and deploy it as a framework. Put a whole report together on infographics, so those of you that don't want to read, you just want to look at graphics, I'm with you. It's like the news you can use in a snapshot. By the way, this report's available widely online. A lot of the analytics reports are available online. It's about 100 pages long, but there is like a convenient 3 or 4 page executive summary that you can tap into if you have a really short attention span. And it gets at interconnected benefits. It gets at the process. It gets at what you're yielding as a result of implementing a commissioning process, what you're avoiding in terms of cost avoidance, which obviously people that are funding major projects and portfolios or groups of projects are interested in the numbers game. A lot of the folks, as you would imagine on Capitol Hill, are really only interested in numbers. So you have to be able to make that argument if you want to change policy. Here's just some spreads on some of the case studies. The case studies include both university context, private client contexts, and public contexts, where none of them are comprehensive, but they all have commissioning-like elements that we pulled forward so that we could demonstrate the utility of this as a concept, and obviously how this framework would engage with our other requirements, federal requirements. This very unlovable diagram up here is really critical. When I was here in school, the traditional mode that you learned about in terms of design and construction was design, bid, and build, right? You design a project for a client, the client bids it out, and then some construction company comes in and builds it. Well, that's really fallen away from a lot of major builders. A lot of major builders have moved into integrated project delivery, construction managers as contractors, design, build, bridging, design, build. And so what does that mean? There are all different ways projects go from planning to a real project on the street. And this unlovable diagram just shows, there's a whole series of these, by the way, that show how site commissioning could be implemented in any type of project delivery model, what the critical inflection points are to study to be able to yield a more optimal result. This is just an update to really something that I think I first really understood in Jack Ahern's course, which was really about adaptive feedback, right? And how do you learn from your process? The federal government wants to say we're special, we have unique requirements, and they do. I mean, quite honestly, the federal government is building things that other private entities are not building, right? I mean, land ports of entry, laboratories for NASA and the like. So that's why I had to build this kind of database for the feds, because they need to know that this is uniquely positioned for them. And it's about what commissioning can do, right? That it can tap into rebates, that we can speak to the broad spectrum of users, both public and private, that we have higher user satisfaction, we have less change orders in construction, that we're able to access rebates from utilities, all of those sorts of things. How do you take kind of a framework on a federal scale? You have to pilot it on projects, right? So we identified a few projects once this was done that we were going to pilot commissioning in. And then we're in that phase. I'm no longer with GSA, they are currently in that phase. I tapped out and they said, and now they're in kind of the pilot phase. Next phase is federal rollout. And at that point, you're kind of changing the industry. There's a lot of folks that are interested in this at this point. But one of the last pieces I left was developing these micro reports on how do you actually apply this in a federal capital construction model. Here's a federal project in Greenville, Mississippi. It's currently under construction. The Delta, Mississippi. This is literally a town away from where Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil, but it's a phenomenally cool place, very aqueous environment, very hydrologically interesting. Project is about 300 feet from the Mississippi River. There's flooding, there's levee, there's sand boils, there's all these really interesting phenomena. And so we thought, hey, why not pick a really challenging project that we can lay this over, this commissioning concept over the top of. This is the design, the architectural design of the project, the entry. But when you look at the actual site design, and I'm gonna wrap in a minute or two, when you look at the actual site design, and there's different elements, there's force protection elements on the perimeter, but within the landscape, there's certain like standard lawn areas and planting beds and rain gardens, and there's systems that move from the site out into the building and the building out to the site. And we were studying those, but then, at some point we have to say, well, what is it that we're gonna commission? What kind of dynamic systems are we gonna look at? And so the red square within the building footprint is the building automation system. That's basically a nerve center for a building. It's where automated blinds go up and down when they follow heliostats. So how the heliostats on the roof work to shine light, direct light into gardens. It's where photovoltaic panels are kind of channeling energy. It's where we can see every classroom in this building and how much energy is being drawn on it. So basically it's this nerve system. And so we basically attached a weather station to this nerve system, put flow meters out into the landscape at the sewer laterals, as well as at the irrigation controllers, and then added flow meters in the site plumbing to and soil moisture sensors to basically start to create this feedback loop where the water we were catching was able to be used to process water and vice versa. And there was a degree of precision brought to this that is currently it's just not in the field. The instrumentation is lacking, basically. So this project is currently in construction. I'm sure, and with that commissioning framework, that means at the program of requirements level, you're setting the performance into the contract budget. When the design team walks in the room, they are already inheriting the performance requirements of the project. They're not asking what they are at that point. They already have clarity and understanding what they are. The commissioning agent, who's a third party, understands what they're responsible to be doing during all of the design integrated project delivery meetings, so that everyone has a stake in this and a working understanding. Here on the screen, you're just seeing some of the design documentation that was probably the first time I've ever seen this brought between landscape architect, building engineer, which was extending spatial models, energy spatial models out into the site to consider thermal performance of landscape features, the critical elements of project turnover, and again, bake all of that into the process. And this is just kind of a project-specific benefit. But with that, that's evolutionary infrastructure. So if we have any questions, I mean, you can ask them out loud, you can just grab me afterwards and ask them however you guys want, or you can say, those are great pictures, I just needed that, I just want to go on my way, whatever you guys feel.
I have a question, Kristen.
Sure.
Wonderful presentation, thank you. I'm curious about when you find or you harness this data from the feedback loop, maybe this is speculative, but what happens if you find that the landscape is not performing the way that it was stated or prescribed? Is there a mechanism built in place to retrofit or do something?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's commissioning, which is done comprehensively at the beginning, and then there's also something called retro commissioning. It's well established. It's done in architectural systems, naval systems, and so the Mariposa Land Port of Entry, for example, there was another little side project. We had to retro commission that project, which basically meant going in, repairing the errors, and then it's called balancing, basically. We had to balance the system. On that particular project, what caught my attention was the water use on the site. This was supposed to be a net zero site, and so when the facility manager said, we just spent $100,000 last year on water for the site, that was a problem, so that's kind of what started it off. We rebalanced the site, and now it is net zero and achieving what it was intended to. So it's a great question. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about, working with such a diverse array of departments, or government agencies, and how, when you're in the early stages of the project, you look to get buy-in from people who may not understand the power of landscape architecture.
Well, I think you need to have someone who's willing to kind of make the case, but I think there's to give you a what I would feel is a more satisfactory answer is basically how federal projects operate is a federal agency, and I was speaking with Jack earlier about this. Many federal agencies are vertical. They're just, you feed into the executive office of the president, and that's, you're in the Forest Service, you never talk to the National Park Service, or you're in EPA, you never talk to Homeland Security. GSA operates horizontally. Our mission was to develop on behalf of the federal government's client agencies. So they have space needs, they have programmatic needs. They would typically come to us, and in the headquarters level, the directors would meet with that client agency and essentially articulate their mission, which their programmatic need, and align it with their mission, and basically put it into what's called the president's budget, the president of the United States budget. At that point, we would start spending money down, pre-planning money, to basically create a lot more detail around the project. But at that point, it goes up to Capitol Hill, and then we would battle with them a bunch. But typically, you can win those battles if you're coming from a kind of a place of knowledge, right? And then the client agencies have a mission they're trying to achieve. So that's when we would be baking, and what some of the criticality of commissioning is, you're baking a lot of that into the cake, if it makes sense. But it requires kind of understanding some of the co-benefits, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and that's maybe it. Sure. Yeah, please.
Something that struck me from the pictures is that all of the architecture strikes me as modern. And for many material reasons, I see architecture in this country as ultimately having to be that way in some way or another, though this can actually look very different, and this is just one example of it. But my point is that if you go throughout different areas in this country, you really see an entire swath, actually, of states, if you will. And what stuck out to me is that I've happened to have been able to be in a lot of places in this country, and you don't typically see buildings that look like this, and they're very impressive. And so my question was if you have any thoughts really generally about like the state of design in this country, because there really is a stark contrast between, let's say, an infrastructure, typically it's its own thing, but let's say one of the bridges to New York that's really, really materially old, and you're just, I don't know, driving on a highway somewhere and you just come across this. And UMass is maybe another example of this, and yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to answer it fully, but I'm gonna give you two answers. One is the GSA has established every architectural landscape architecture firm wants to work for the GSA. They have a design excellence program that was established in 1993 in response to a whole lot of banality in federal architecture. And that design excellence program basically has 5 tenets to it. One of the tenets is actually that architecture, landscape architecture, should represent the regional traditions of different areas of the country. So quite honestly, if you go to the Sun Belt region, the southeast of the United States, there's a lot of like heavy masonry classical buildings, even coming out of GSA today in those areas. They're not always steel and glass, and quite honestly, a lot of those heavy masonry structures just perform better from energy perspectives. You know, they're not always, people have different tastes, but looking at them just from performance perspectives, and you have to also understand that the government, unlike a private developer who's developing for 5 years, spec developer developing for 5 years, they're gonna be in and out. The government builds for 100-year projects. So they're putting different type of energy and money into durability, into performance, things of that nature. So that's one thing. But I think the bigger question that maybe you were getting at, which is also really astute and kind of a good one, is that I think the nature of construction has really changed, you know, and that's probably going back to, like, I don't know, Ethan Carr can probably talk about it in greater detail and much more eloquently than me, but about the kind of relationship between labor and material costs, and kind of, you know, you need a lot less skilled labor to do steel and glass, and it's a lot quicker to build that way than it is to build heavy masonry, heavily worked buildings today. But that being said, it's the notion, at least, is that there's, you know, regional traditions being represented, but there's clients. At the end of the day, if you're doing the federal courthouse, you have a chief judge and then the other judges that are associated with them that are also your client of sorts, right? I mean, they, you know, if you're doing a project for Department of Homeland Security, the secretary and then the deputies, they're your clients. So you're not just designing and delivering and planning a project in extension of the real world, right? You're kind of a broker between people that actually have tastes, but you're trying to hold up the democratic ideals of society and then kind of translate that into architecture and design, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
Terrific presentation. Christian, so maybe clarification for how does it work time-wise? Like, I mean, how long does it take for like planning, execution of a project? When you're coming in, when are you setting the standards, and maybe you change the standards over time. So how does all that work, like in the flow? I mean, you see
so
some of these charts, but I mean, you can expand a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the GSA has a facility standard. It's about 350 pages. I was the chair of landscape and civil and geotechnical for 10 years. I literally wrote that standard 6 times. It gets renewed every 2 years. And we moved it from, when I arrived, it was a prescriptive standard saying you have to achieve X, Y, and Z. We moved it to a performance standard because different client agencies had different interests. Forest Service, it was very different than FBI, right? So that, I guess that maybe speaks a little bit to the standards. Those are embedded with the contract. You'll use the facility standard from 2022 in this contract. That's in the contract between the, and again, renewed every 2 years with updates, etc. It's actually currently, the 2024 is currently after draft review, if anyone has any comments. The other piece was, I think you were asking about kind of the general timeline. So I'm not sure if I should show the LA courthouse. There's a new courthouse that we have built in downtown Los Angeles, 420. We invited 3 competitor firms to bid for that project. We gave them a stipend. From the moment we invited them to cutting the ribbon on that project was 30 months. So some of the projects are fast, like that's pretty fast in a market like Los Angeles. And then certain projects like the US Coast Guard one took probably 4.5 years, but that one had a huge change order. I mean, there was expansive marine soils on an entire slope that it was a $55 million change order. So every project is unique, you know, but it gives you a sense, you know. And then the Javits project, which was just a plaza. I mean, it was a waterproofing of a garage deck and a plaza. That was done probably in 18 months, 20 months.
Okay. Thank
you.
Yeah, thank you. That was everything I expected and more.
Great.
But I would like to ask you to give some advice to our faculty colleagues that are here, especially the junior faculty who have a long career ahead of them, and the students who, of course, have a really long career ahead of them, about what kind of new opportunities do you see not everybody can be the director of design for the GSA, okay? But, you know, do you see a need for professionals that have this mix of design and strategy skills and understanding for the students to just put that bug in their ear, in their head? And for the faculty, you know, I know you're working with Maryland and you've worked with a lot of universities, but what are some opportunities for faculty to partner with GSA or LAF or other organizations that are kind of leading this new paradigm development?
Yeah, so there's GSA, I mean, I kind of feel like I built the wheel there, and it's kind of moving along. They just issued an RFP 2 weeks ago for landscape analytics and 2 projects. So that's a $150,000 commission. Faculty should be looking for those things, you know? That's a 1-year study, 2 sites, kind of deep dive, right? So I would encourage people to look at that, because that kind of gets you into kind of this thinking about how can you be at the table to produce knowledge that then recommendations can be made to, hey, I would recommend changing your delivery strategy in this way or that way. In terms of students, yes, I think that essentially advisory service, the kind of melding of advisory services and strategic advisory services with design knowledge it's got I think it's a $1 billion industry. I think it's got huge potential because there is there's clients that have enormous portfolios that they don't know how to reposition. And there's government agencies, and again, I say we're in this kind of period of experimental governance. There's clients that are being faced with the fact that their buildings have kind of reached obsolescence, and they have to start thinking about what is a building, what is a site, what does it mean to kind of produce something that is high performing and is compelling enough to kind of be reborn as something else. And quite honestly, if you're just purely operating in that design realm, then you have a very limited ability to kind of influence. You're coming in at a stage that the program of requirements has been baked, the pre-planning has happened, they've selected a site, they've already identified your budget. You know, I mean, you're essentially, I don't want to suggest that it's being a stylist by any means, because there's integrated systems, there's a lot of wonderful things happening. But if your desire, I would say, is to operate on a scale that's going to propel the industry forward and be able to really confront the challenges that obviously we all know are in front of us, then we need more people operating in that space. And I think clients now are only becoming more aware of that. Developers really over the last 10, 12 weeks are really only now getting their properties pulled back by the banks because they can't meet mortgages. Banks are going to be holding these assets with how do they re-envision them. We're kind of on this major change. And the pandemic, I think, just propelled that change forward. But that's what I would say. I would say to kind of any person getting into this industry now is, it's wonderful. I love the craft of design. I've always loved that. But I would also say if you have an interest in kind of the strategy and creating a world that's different than the one we live in now, then you have to think about how do you bring these lessons in this toolbox to a greater audience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe we would wrap it up, and questions aren't going anywhere. So if there's other questions, please feel free to come up and ask him some more questions or chat. And thank you very much for coming.